They disappeared for a full 1,500 years, and death came to them in a single second. Their return happened through a surprising coincidence: a darkness that covered the sun, a terror that rotted their souls caught them. Before I begin to tell you not the ordinary story of the destruction in Pompeii, but much more than that, don't forget to subscribe to and follow my channel for new adventures. The real story of people who turned to stone. If you want to listen to the merciless story of a city that vanished within seconds, lean back and get ready for this exciting 2,000-year journey. Look carefully at these photographs. They are ordinary people known as the 13 fugitives who were trying to escape from Pompeii. While trying to save their lives, a 350°C wind erased them all in a single second. Some were hugging each other, some were asleep, some were praying to the gods, left exactly as they were. Was this God's punishment, or an ordinary natural disaster? And how did they turn to stone? And what did they experience in the last 24 hours? 79 AD, Pompeii. In the city of Pompeii, located on the coasts of Italy and belonging to the Roman Empire, with a population of 15,000, life was as lively as ever, and thanks to its rich volcanic soil, agricultural productivity was much higher than in other Roman cities. Maritime trade had also made the city quite wealthy. Pompeii, where the summer villas of Roman nobles were located, was an ideal region for vacations and short getaways. In arenas built 100 years before the Colosseum in Rome, gladiator fights were held. Wild parties were thrown in brothels. Slaves fulfilled every unimaginable need of their masters. People enjoyed pleasant time in the baths and shopped in the Forum. Thanks to its wealth and being a gateway to the world, the architectural structure and art of the well-educated Pompeians were developed enough to influence both Europe and, years later, American architecture. In the city of Pompeii, there were more than 100 taverns and inns where sailors and travelers could spend time. And of course, the most profitable profession was baking. Look at this wall painting. We see the baker Terentius Neo of Pompeii and his wife. The scroll held by Terentius Neo, one of the wealthy figures of the city, shows that, as in life, his wife was also his partner in business. It is obvious they had a happy home, but they were unaware that a great disaster was waiting for them very soon. In addition, the temples in Pompeii were filled with devout Romans. And Romans did not only believe in gods, they were also interested in black magic. In a charm found during excavations, even spells made by one of the women who could not share the same man were discovered. Although people continued their normal lives, they were also aware that something had been going wrong lately in the face of the natural events taking place. The earthquakes that had continued for weeks had begun to cause panic among the public. The city's water pipes were damaged. Some of the baths and pools had become unusable, and more than half of the Pompeians, especially the wealthy, had begun to quietly leave the city. However, no one thought that the earthquakes were caused by movements in Mount Vesuvius, which was located 8 kilometers from the city and had been dormant for years. When they understood this, it would already be too late. Mount Vesuvius was the most active volcano on the European mainland, and more than 3 million people were still living around it. For this reason, it is considered one of the deadliest volcanoes in the world. At the same time, it had another historical importance. It was the volcano where Spartacus escaped with 77 companions and hid, and for some time, it had been in a delicate sleep, ready to awaken. Now we are going together to its awakening 2,000 years ago. Mount Vesuvius carried out its first major eruption years later, on October 24th, 79, at 9 a.m. An unexpected apocalypse began for Pompeii, and the people of the city rushed out into the streets, jolted by a huge roar. For the people of Pompeii, who could not make sense of what was happening, this was a beginning. For the people gathered in the city's ancient theater to discuss what to do in the face of what they were experiencing, there was still no reason to fear an ordinary mountain covered with trees. Even though the situation seemed temporary, the frightening scene created by the volcanic eruption caused an important part of the population to flee the city. When the time reached noon, Vesuvius erupted for the second time. But this was a disaster far greater than the morning eruption. The power of this eruption was thousands of times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The volcano began spewing 100,000 tons of ash, lava, and pumice per second. With the force of the eruption, the roofs of many houses were blown off, and people were hurled from where they stood. Panic began in the city. A 35-kilometer column composed of lava and ash particles rose into the sky, creating an unimaginable, terrifying scene. A colossal mass of lava, ash, and stone rising 35 kilometers from a mountain. Two hours after the second eruption, the sky had already been covered with black smoke. Seeing the sun had become completely impossible. All those who could raise their heads saw nothing but smoke, ash, and stone. The volcano was no longer spewing only lava and ash. Pumice stones ejected from Vesuvius were falling onto Pompeii like rain, and 30-centimeter piles were beginning to form in the streets. Black smoke, stretching for tens of thousands of kilometers, was creating lightning of unbelievable intensity. Imagine pumice stones from the black smoke that covered the sun, ash rains, and massive lightning bolts painting the sky red every second. The Pompeians must have thought the gods were fighting each other. Because after the second eruption, realizing the severity of the situation, the people had fallen into complete chaos. Not knowing what to do, people ran through the streets with pillows on their heads to protect themselves from the stones raining down on them, trying to take shelter in houses they thought were safe. Those who managed to enter their homes locked their doors to avoid looting, and the pumice stones falling on them were no longer as small as in the first eruption. They were much larger and harder. In the archaeological excavations, the bodies of 396 people who died in Pompeii due to the rain of pumice stones were reached. When it was around 5 p.m., the volcanic debris reaching Pompeii was still not hot or poisonous. Yes, the city had been covered with the volcano's smoke. Ash piles approaching 50 centimeters had accumulated in the streets, and the rain of pumice stones falling from the sky had increased. However, a mass that was deadly poisonous or hot had not yet reached the city. At first, deaths occurred due to the rain of stones and the collapse of roofs under the weight that had accumulated on them. So much so that it is assumed that 1/3 of Pompeii's victims died due to collapsing roofs. Meanwhile, another city, together with those living in it, had already been wiped out. The city of Herculaneum, closer to Mount Vesuvius, had been covered by a pyroclastic flow, and the entire population had already died. The destruction in Herculaneum had happened so quickly that the eggs and fresh bread you see now still remained just as they were on the first day. And this is a charred baby who could not even live the life waiting for it in the eruption. Yet it is still talked about 2,000 years later. One wonders which it would have preferred. Herculaneum would be completely destroyed under volcanic waste, forgotten, and in 1738, it would be discovered by workers digging the foundations of a summer palace for Charles of Bourbon, King of Naples. Let us continue our real story, Pompeii, from where we left off. Despite everything, the Pompeians thought the situation would improve, and the rich chained their slaves so they would not flee, waiting for the disaster to pass. However, the thickness of the black clouds was tens of thousands of meters, and their speed was hundreds of kilometers. And at that time, most of the 2,000 people who had still not left the city were alive. Look at the man you see in this picture, one of Pompeii's most iconic symbols, and a muleteer. It is thought that he made his living by carrying loads, because when he was found, the mule's body was preserved just like his. Fate caught him while he was trying to enter a toilet locked from the inside. According to archaeologists, even though he knocked on the door many times, no one answered, and he tried to hide under his blanket and lived his final fate. How do we know that there were people in Pompeii on the night that connected October 24th to October 25th who thought everything would return to normal? Because people who continued to have fun in bars met their deaths there, and the cash boxes in the bars were still full. There were slaves who continued serving their masters. The piles of pumice and ash in the streets had reached 80 centimeters, and even walking was almost impossible. It was an unbelievable situation. Yet there were still people who continued to have fun. Perhaps this was, in their own way, a final farewell of an accepted helplessness. We will never know exactly what happened. While they continued to have fun, the destructive wave was still about to come. Up to that point in Pompeii, there had been ash, smoke, and pumice rain. The destructive gas clouds that would deliver the killing blow had crashed into the city walls several times at great speed and dispersed, buying the people of Pompeii a little more time to survive. But in the last great wave, a 350 degrees Celsius fire cloud enveloped the city at 100 kilometers per hour, and the last surviving Pompeians died without even understanding what had hit them. It took only a second for them to lose their lives. In their final moments, they felt nothing and saw nothing. Most of all those people we see today, eating, sleeping, embracing each other, were those who died in this last great fire cloud. Without even understanding what was happening, they remained exactly in the forms of their final moments, and they died as a story for generations 2,000 years later. At 8 a.m. on October 25th, there was no one left alive in Pompeii. The scorching cloud that managed to reach the city had annihilated each of them, and the piles in the streets had reached 3 meters. At the end of the ash rain that continued for days, the city was completely buried underground, and Pompeii was written into the pages of history as a city that vanished within seconds. But we know the entire process that took place in Pompeii, the fear on people's faces, the pain, the magnitude of the eruption, minute by minute. Because one person who witnessed all of this disaster managed to survive. He was Pliny the Younger, Plinius Minor. Together with his uncle Pliny the Elder, Plinius Major, as soon as he heard about the eruption, he came to Pompeii and began to note the developments. 25 years after the eruption, Pliny the Younger described the event in detail in letters, ensuring that it reached us today. Until 2022, it was believed that the eruption had occurred in August. However, as a result of studies and common findings, in 2022, archaeologists and scientists became certain that the event had taken place in October. Both the clothing of the bodies that were removed was more suitable for October to November rather than August, and the vegetables and fruits that greengrocers sold during the days of the disaster were also products of the October season. When other findings were added, it is thought that the exact date was October 24th and 25th, 79. The rediscovery of the city of Pompeii, just like Herculaneum, was nothing more than a coincidence. In 1592, workers struck ancient walls covered with paintings and inscriptions while digging an underground water channel at the mills of architect Domenico Fontana. Yes, this was the lost city of Pompeii. However, it was not given much attention, and excavation work in the region had to wait about 200 more years. The fact that 99% of the people found in the archaeological excavations remained like stone in mold form is, contrary to what you know, because the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli, who conducted the excavations at the end of the 1800s, had plaster poured through the holes they opened in order to remove the corpses without disturbing the positions of the bones. In other words, most of the people you see were cast in order to preserve their positions. They were not turned to stone by the disaster itself. As a matter of fact, 1,150 bodies have been removed in Pompeii to date, and only 106 of these were brought to light as casts. The rest were removed as skeletons, since there was no need to make casts. In total, it is thought that close to 2,000 people died in the catastrophe in Pompeii. Most of the dead were the elderly and the sick, or devoted children who did not want to leave their families, and also slaves who were held by force. Very few rich people did not escape from Pompeii and died. The Pompeii catastrophe was, in all its aspects, one of the most dramatic scenes history has ever seen. This is clear and certain. However, the catastrophe left us the best preserved city of the Roman world, an archaeological excavation site where we can come closest to the world of antiquity. There is no other ancient city in the world that has been preserved as well as Pompeii. We owe this to Vesuvius's ashes covering the city. In other words, we owe it to this catastrophe. Look carefully at this house. Its name is the Villa of the Mysteries. Its walls are covered with the religious drawings of the Romans and the family's happy days. But the last thing left from it was this little girl. And this is the Villa of Diomedes. Right now it is a ruined wreck, but look at its splendor in those years. What remained of it were 36 bodies. In the basement of the house, 18 women and children, probably servants, gave their last breaths while clinging to each other. Life is full of catastrophes, pain, and sorrow. Even though 2,000 years have passed, those who lived through all of this were people like us. They were people with emotions, families, who loved each other, who had dreams. Many of them were unaware of the disaster that would befall them. Many were innocent, poor, hopeless people. This was not God's punishment. Many of the people whom God would punish had already left the city. As always, the bad won, and the innocent died.